Blessings to everybody. It's Shabbat. It's Shabbat. We're here again for another weekly study. So we praise Yah. We bless Him for everything that He's doing and everything that He has in store for us. We don't really know uh, what Yahweh would do until He does it. And so it's been a good week for me, a tiring week, but a good week. Um, but there's nothing like resting on the Shabbat. So here we are. Today we're going to be talking about what exactly is the Torah. And Epiphanius' Hanarian, he makes a point to tell us in two separate occasions that there were groups that, like the Nazareans or the Nazareans and the Ebionites, that believed that Moses received the law, but the Pentateuch was not that law. And I've already spoken and talked about the documentary hypothesis and what that means. It simply means that the Pentateuch was not written by one person. It wasn't written by Moses. But there is a part in there that's written by Moses. And so these groups believe that Moses did not receive that Moses received the law, but he did not receive the Pentateuch. And so that being significant is very significant because Christianity, Judaism, Islam proclaims the Old Testament as whole and the New Testament as whole. And so, today we're going to be talking about this. I'm going to review what we've been talking about in the documentary hypothesis. And so I've basically been going through the Yahweh text, the text of the original Yahwehs. And so um, the original Yahwehs believed that um, the original Yahwehs, I forgot my train of thought, I'm sorry. The original Yahwehs believed, as demonstrated in Genesis chapter 2, that Yahweh was the God of origins, that He was the God of creation, that He was the God that created man with His own hands. It doesn't say how He created the animals, but it just says that Yahweh created man with His own hands. And man was given authority over creation. When we skip to Genesis chapter 4, we see that the true worshipers descend from Cain, who was the first son of Adam. In Christianity and Judaism, we know him as the murderer, the one who murdered his brother. But the Kenites understood that sin is only momentary. And so they didn't have a doctrine of condemnation. So Cain killed his brother, and Yahweh didn't condemn him. On the contrary, He protected him. He put a mark on him so that he would not be killed by anyone else. So we see that. We see the flood. We see the Tower of Babel. What we don't see in the Yahweh's text is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We have to understand that the original worshipers of Yahweh were not Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, nor was it Noah. It didn't have anything to do with them and their genealogy. It had to do with um, it had to do with the children of Cain. So the Kenites were the children of Cain, and they learned their worship from their father. Okay, and what you basically that's basically it with the Yahweh's text. There's nothing really intent. There are no commandments. Um, but uh, I didn't really want to talk about the L text, the L tradition. But because it's part of the Pentateuch, I'm gonna talk about it. So the L tradition starts in Genesis chapter 14 with Abraham coming to save Lot. Um, so so it's very well established in the Pentateuch and in the Torah that Abraham worshipped El. Isaac blessed Jacob in the name of El. Jacob worshipped El and called him El Eloi Bethel. So that's three times in one name, in one sitting, that El Eloi Bethel. It's a lot of L right there. It's a lot of L. And then he was named Israel. Not only that, but archaeology proves that that Jacob worshipped El. El is at the end of his name. So Levi worshipped El. El is at the end of his name. Joseph worshipped El. El is at the end of his name in the hieroglyphics, in the Egyptian hieroglyphics. There were whole cities called there was a city called Jacob El, Joseph El, um, Levi El. So um, the patriarchs were worshippers of El and not worshippers of Yahweh. And that might not make sense to a lot of people, but you have to understand that Yahweh and El were two different deities from two different origins. And so, one of the things that I noticed is that in the El tradition, you read chapter 14, and it seems to confirm archaeology that Canaan was a colony of the Mesopotamian empire. And so let's go there for a minute. Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14. For those of you guys in the Hebrew names and the Hebrew roots, Bereshit chapter 14. So Genesis chapter 14, starting at in the first verse. It says, Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14, verse 1 says, And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Shoderla Omer, king of Elam, and Tadar, king of nations. All of these places, Shinar, Elasar, and Elam, these are parts of Mesopotamia. Elam is Persia. Okay, Elasar is part of Babylon. Shinar is Shinar is Babylon, and Elasar is Mesopotamia, and then Tidal, king of nations, meaning he had a large empire. That these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, and Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemaber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the valley of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Shendorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. So the king uh, of Elam, the king of Elam. I'm sorry, I might have, I might be contradicting myself right now, but Elam is Mesopotamia. Okay, that whole Persia, Babylonian part that was considered part of Mesopotamia. So it says for 12 years they served the king of Elam, and then they rebelled in the 13th year. So Abraham is coming into this whole atmosphere at this time when Canaan is trying to break away from Elam. Abram comes in on the wrong side, though. He doesn't come in and defend Mesopotamia. He comes in simply to save Lot, but Lot was in Sodom, was out not in Sodom but outside of Sodom, and because he was outside of Sodom, he was taken. And so this is the introduction that we get to Abram in the El tradition. The El tradition, let me go back. The Yahweh tradition, we see Cain setting up a city, so we know where the cities of refuge come from. So the idea of the city of refuge is original to the Yahweh text. But what we don't see is a priesthood. We don't see any talk of priests. We don't see any talk of a tabernacle or a place of worship or altars. But we do hear them calling on the name of Yahweh. And so that's the big difference. But in the El tradition is talking about, it talks about the tabernacle. It talks about the tithe because Jacob was a worshiper of Yah, and he promised to give his tithe. And then we have the priesthood because Abraham gave his tithe to Shem, to Melchizedek, to Melchizedek. Okay, and so we get the priesthood from the El tradition. Shalom, Brother Matthias. I'm glad you could join us. So that's the El tradition also puts an emphasis on sacrifices. Archaeology has shown that the worship of El comes from Mesopotamia. And the worshippers of El had very specific sacrifices that they made. Okay, they had very specific sacrifices, and they matched the sacrifices that are in what you call it in Leviticus to a T. Okay, so and then it's Abraham. The first time we see a building of an altar is with Noah and Abraham. So Noah builds an altar to Yahweh and makes a sacrifice. Abraham builds an altar to Yahweh. Isaac builds an altar to Yahweh. Jacob builds altars and sets up pillars to Yahweh. And so this is a trend of the El tradition. So what's also in the El tradition is Exodus 21 to 23. And it gives a bunch of commandments because all of those commandments originate from Mesopotamia. And that's how you know that the El worshippers their standard was the law of Hammurabi. And so that's what you see when you compare the law of Hammurabi and Exodus 21 to 23. You see the law of Hammurabi. And so um, that's what you know. This is it was pretty interesting to me. That's what I got out of it. What else? So the Yahweh text is kind of vague. It doesn't give us any commandments, but you can see in the text of Scripture how the Kenites lived. I do want to give a study on the Kenites and how they, what they did and how they functioned and where they were, but I haven't gotten to it. I'm sorry. I'll get to it soon. Um, but moving on, when you get to the Yahweh alone tradition, the Yahweh alone tradition is the tradition that writes the Deuteronomy. The specific part of Deuteronomy that they write is um, from Deuteronomy 12 to Deuteronomy 28. Remember that it was a covenant, and it has to do with Josiah and all those things. Okay, so but the stories that come from that Deuteronomy, from that book of Deuteronomy, those come from the JE tradition, from the mix of the Yahweh and El traditions that happened around the time of Hezekiah. We say that it happened around the time of Hezekiah because Hezekiah's writings the are in the Proverbs. So it couldn't have been the book of Proverbs could not have been written by Solomon because Hezekiah's Proverbs are in the book of Proverbs too. So these are things that we try to look away from when we're reading the text. Oh, it talks about the Proverbs of Hezekiah. The preacher might be Hezekiah. We don't know. But it's someone who's related to Hezekiah in some way. He's the son of David. And so what I want to express is that there was a comment in one of the videos because I don't believe in the custom of baptism, circumcision as forms of conversion. Even though those are prevalent, even though we see Yeshua talking about those. And one of the comments that was made that I wanted to address was that just because it comes from a different place doesn't make it evil. That's true. Because when you really look at the scriptures, there is there's not really a standard of this is good and this is evil. It's just that these are traditions that are followed. And my stance when it comes to tradition is I like the original. I prefer the original tradition, and because baptism and circumcision are not the original traditions, I don't practice them. Not that anyone who does is evil or anyone who does is, apostate or anything. But, if you want to do it, that's up to you, but I choose not to. And so, going back to the Yahweh alone tradition, the Yahweh alone tradition was probably written around the time of Hezekiah, between Hezekiah and Josiah. The book of Deuteronomy, starting at chapter 12, that was clearly written by Josiah himself, King Josiah, who made a covenant to take away all of the idols. And so this was different than the Yahweh and the El tradition because the Yahweh and the El tradition had a tendency to coexist with other deities and with other, you know, religious beliefs and other gods. And so even in Genesis chapter 11, you have Yahweh saying, "Let us go down," and confuse them. So Yahweh goes down with whoever else he went down with. It apparently it must be other gods or godlike beings or spirits that yeah, she's gonna talk. She's been doing that for a while. So um yeah, so I lost my train of thought. And so when we get to the Yahweh alone tradition, the Yahweh alone tradition basically says it's Yahweh and nobody else. But by the time the Yahweh alone tradition comes along, the Yahweh and the Elohim traditions have already been mixed. And so it takes from what it knows, which is a pattern that we see in the scripture. It takes from what it knows, and it just merges it into, into their tradition. And so they have a merging of the Yahweh and the El traditions together, and that's how it functions. So the story of Abram being called by Yahweh to go into Canaan, that comes from the Yahweh alone tradition. Um, chapter 15, Genesis chapter 15, basically comes from the Yahweh alone tradition, where they believe that Yahweh was the one that made the covenant with Abram. And so with that, but we do see a centralization of worship. Everybody has to go to Jerusalem. Everybody has to go to the place where Yahweh placed his name. And apparently that's Jerusalem. So we see that centralization, whereas the Yahweh tradition says, oh, you can worship at any place and call on the name of Yahweh at any time. So after that is the priestly tradition, the Zedekite tradition, which was probably written by Ezekiel. Ezekiel decides. The text of Ezekiel sounds a lot like certain texts in the Torah, especially when he says, "I am Yahweh who sanctifies you." That's Ezekiel's signature. And so we know that Ezekiel had to have written parts of the, and that's so bad, isn't it? Oh my gosh. Ezekiel forged Moses' signature. But
we see those hints though in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A lot
yeah,
of people forged scriptures together.
that was actually something that was pretty common. They had signatures. You just have to look for them. They don't say, "Well, this is my signature. You will know me by da 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 da." But they had signatures. And when you read the book of Ezekiel, you can see he plainly says, "I am Yahweh who sanctifies you." He says it outright. So when you see those verses, those texts in the Torah, you know that it's Ezekiel that wrote those parts. Okay. Now, there is a Torah of Moses, and this is the point of the study today. It took me 20 minutes to get to that, but this is the part that we need to understand. There is a Torah of Moses. But before we get to that Torah of Moses, I want to give you a little bit of background. Now, the children of Israel are already in Egypt. They're in Egypt and they're living in wherever they're living. They were there when the Hyksos were there. When the Hyksos left, a big majority, big tribes of the Israelites left with the Hyksos and went into Canaan. Um, but there was a small amount that stayed behind in Egypt, and because they stayed behind in Egypt, the Egyptians were afraid that they would again become powerful because they were a small group when they first came into Egypt, Um, and then all of a sudden they became huge and powerful, and they were able to become kings and take certain positions. The Egyptians didn't want that to happen again. The reason why they kicked the Hyksos out was not because they were kings, but because they were neglecting the gods of the Egyptians. The Hyksos were worshiping El, which is the Egyptian god Seth, but they were neglecting the other gods. And so the Egyptians got fed up. They rose up against the Hyksos and they kicked them out of the land of Egypt. And then afterwards, every year, they would go and they would do campaigns in the land of Egypt just to oppress the Hyksos, just to persecute them, and they would take them hostage. And so, and I'm not even gonna go into that. I was about to say, this is what Africa. This is brings us right into Africa, right? They take them, they kick them out of their land, and then they oppress them, and continually take them captive and make them into slaves. So that's a story for another day. Um, but there was a certain amount of Semites that um, that stayed behind, and the Egyptians decided to persecute them and decided to enslave them and decided to oppress them so that they would not become strong again. And so, in the midst of this, Moses is born. And Moses, this is historical, you guys. How do you know this is historical? Because there is a man named Third Moses. Moses is an Egyptian name. Aaron or Aharon is an Egyptian name. Their father's name was Amram. That's an Egyptian name. They've made it into a Hebraic name now after centuries and centuries and centuries of use. But those are Egyptian names. And so third Moses um, was educated in the Pharaoh's house, in the house of the king. And so you can imagine that when he brought the people out, he was very educated and he was very well knowledgeable of Egyptian purity rites. And so this is why in the Zedekite tradition, there is a mixing of El worship and Egyptian purity rituals, but it's done in the name of Yahweh because Moses learned. This is where Jethro comes in. Moses learned uh, the worship of Yahweh and the name of Yahweh. He may have just learned the name, like a lot of people are doing nowadays in the sacred name movement. They're learning the name and they're adopting Christian doctrine and adopting Hebrew roots doctrine, um, while just saying, well, the name, you have to use this name. And so we can understand where the sacred name thing comes from because Moses seems to be doing that same thing. So Moses learned about the worship of Yahweh from his father-in-law, who apparently was a priest. That's kind of difficult for me to accept that he was a priest, but I would be able to accept that he was a Kenite. If he was a Kenite, he didn't have to be a priest. He may have been a chieftain.
They didn't have proof.
They didn't have priests. The Kenites didn't have priests. Okay, they didn't have priests. They may have had Nazarites though. Um, and the Nazarite, we see that in the JE tradition. So the fact that there's a Nazarite in the JE tradition means that either it must have come from the J tradition because the L tradition has the Yahweh's tradition doesn't seem to have any type of leadership. So
no Nazarite.
But the Nazarites may have been that leadership.
Oh, okay.
And then in the book of Jeremiah, when we talk about The Kenites, we're also going to talk about the Nazarites and how they fit in. But the El tradition has priests. So the Zedekite tradition calls Jethro the priest of Midian. And Moses learns, no, he doesn't. Moses learns um, the worship of Yahweh from Jethro. Okay? He learns it from Jethro. Jethro teaches him the worship of Yahweh. He goes into Egypt and takes the people out. In my opinion, is that he used the plagues. He took advantage of the plagues to say, this is the power of Yahweh. Okay? And uh, so then he leads the Levites out. I do believe that it was the Levites he led out and not the other tribes. Maybe one or two other tribes, but
All of them.
not all of them. It wasn't all of them. They were the JE tradition establishes that the Levites were not in the land of Canaan during the age of the judges. Isn't that interesting? Because you look at the book of Judges, and it seems to be all the way through, all the way through. There's a consistency, but then at the end of Judges and at the beginning of Samuel, there seems to be some type of gap there, and you can tell because all of a sudden there's a priest where the book of Judges never talks about priests. All of a sudden, there's a priest called Eli. We don't know how he got there, but he's there. He's there already. And so in the book of Judges, the majority, there were at least 10 tribes. And this is another reason why it was so easy for Israel to be divided, because there were already tribes of Israel in Canaan. They were a part of the Hyksos, they were a part of the Canaanites. And then the Levites come, and they come with a separate tradition, and their tradition prevails over the tradition that's already there in the land of Canaan. And so when you start the book of First Samuel, that's when you see the Levites are there for some reason. Okay? So let's see. Let's think about this, you guys. I was going somewhere with this. So, but Moses was very well educated in Egyptian rites. He was educated by the Egyptians. Hello. He was very well educated. And even in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, it tells us that I think it's either in the book of Acts or in the book of Hebrews, it tells us that Moses was educated in Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh was not ignorant. Pharaoh was not ignorant by any means. And so Moses, being the adopted son of Pharaoh's, the adopted nephew of Pharaoh, um, is a very important thing. Not only that, though, the mother that adopted Moses was the co-regent. She was the co-regent with Pharaoh. So she reigned alongside of Pharaoh. And then you have Moses, who is her son. So Moses is a prince of Egypt, you guys. He's adopted though. And it may have come to light that he found out that he was a Hebrew. And he decided to run away. And he came back to free his people. But Moses does write a law. Moses may have had an experience on the Mount of Sinai, Mount Sinai. But that experience was a volcano. Yeah, it was a volcano. Mount Sinai was burnt on the top. It's a volcano. Look it up. Not the one that's in the Sinai Peninsula, the one that's in Saudi Arabia. So yeah, Moses had an experience, and the volcano was erupted, and he said, "This is God speaking to you," and he wrote a law. And that law, what it has in it, this is so interesting, you guys. It doesn't have the tabernacle in it. It does not have the tabernacle in it.
Moses time?
No, because the tabernacle came later. The tabernacle was merged when the Levitical tradition was merged with the El tradition. But the Levite, let me go back because I feel like I'm forgetting something. We know that the the tabernacle has something to do with the Zedekite tradition. How do we know? Because it tells us that there was a king named Ahab, right, Sister Hannah?
Yes.
A king named Ahab who went to Damascus and saw an altar, and he had the priest. Do you know what text that is?
No.
The priest's name is Abijah. Let me find it for you right now. I need water, you guys. My mouth is dry.
Preach for her dad,
When I don't preach, my daughter preaches for me, y'all. Abijah. So the priest's name is Abijah. Where is it? I don't want to use the altar. Okay, so I'll just do this.
Abijah, you said, right?
Abijah. So I found his name.
Abijah of Judah?
Is
Abijah?
Hold on.
The fourth king of House of David?
What?
Oh, Abijah and Abijah are the same.
Huh? Abijah? No, not the king. It's a priest named Abijah.
Oh.
How did I find it the last time? Is it Ahab?
Priest of division of Abijah. Is it Luke?
No, it's in the book of Kings. I'm scrolling. Scrolling. But the gist of the text, just so I can move on, is that
1 Kings 14:31.
14. That sounds about right. Oh, 16. 2 Kings. It's Urijah the priest. Sorry, I was almost correct. Urijah. So in 2 Kings 16, it says 2 Kings 16 and verse 10. It says, and King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser king of Assyria, and saw an altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest the fashion of the altar and the pattern of it according to all the workmanship thereof. And Uriah the priest built an altar according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it against King Ahaz. Made it against King Ahaz. Came from Damascus. So where do these patterns for the tabernacle come from?
Mm-hmm.
They come from Damascus. And who do they worship in Damascus? They're Syrians. They worship El. So um, let's keep going. Verse 12. And when the king was come from Damascus, the king saw the altar, and the king approached to the altar and offered thereon, and he burnt his burnt offering and his meat offering. These are all terms that are used in Leviticus, the burnt offering and the meat offering, and his drink offering, and sprinkled the blood of his peace offerings upon the altar. So the measurements for the tabernacle came from, in the Torah it says it came from Yahweh. But in the book of Second Kings, it comes from um, Syria. Now, you may not understand the correlation that I'm making here, because it sounds like in Second Kings that there's just an altar, whereas in the Torah it's talking about a whole tabernacle. But look at the vocabulary here. He burnt offerings, meat offerings, drink offerings, peace offerings. All of this terminology is used in Leviticus. So, and it has to do with these terms and these specific offerings were also found in the archaeological dig of, I think it's Ugarit, where they found out about the worship of El. And he had these specific offerings. So it wasn't just the altar, because in verse 14 it says, and he brought also the brazen altar, meaning that the brazen altar may have been made first, which was before the Lord from the forefront of the house. Look at that. So the altar of incense was in the front, and they moved it to the back. Okay, and so they're making it seem like, the tabernacle was already built. At this time, there was a temple made. Not only was there a temple made in this by the time this second King 16 text is supposed to be written, but there was a temple in the time of Samuel. Come on now. There are inconsistencies in the text here, because David was supposed to be the one who built the temple. But in Samuel, y'all don't believe me. That's okay. That is all right. That is all right. Let's see. I have to find for you guys the specific verse. But 1 Samuel 1 says, and this man, talks about the father of Samuel, went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto Yahweh of hosts in Shiloh. Okay? That doesn't say enough, does it? Let's keep going. Verse 9. So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh and after they had drunk. Now Eli the priest sat upon a seat by a post of the temple of Yahweh. It's not the same word Mishkan. That Hebrew word for temple is Heikal. Heikal is a public building. It was a temple. In the time of Samuel, there was already a temple. But David came and built a bigger temple, or David made plans for a bigger temple. Okay? And so David established Levitical worship in the way that we see the Levites lined up now. In the way that people are saying, even in the Temple Scroll, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that order comes from David. But before David, there was already a public building for worship. In other words, there was a temple for Yahweh. Okay? A palace, a temple, a nave, and a sanctuary. Are you getting it? Are you understanding it? I'm always talking about the inconsistencies in the text. All right.
So originally there was a temple. That was it.
There was a temple.
But then they just started adding all this other stuff.
They started adding other things. Yep.
It was just a temple together, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And they would come and they would give their sacrifices. And then they would go about their way. So, backing up. What does the Torah of Moses consist of? Because we're 46 minutes in, almost 47 minutes in. This is the part that I really want to get to. What does the Torah of Moses consist of? The Torah of Moses consists of the Egyptian purity rites that are done in the name of Yahweh. What does that mean? That means from Leviticus, let me think of the text. From Leviticus 11.
Who lost? Who lost?
Ooh. Because the food laws, you don't see them anywhere early in any earlier text. So it's not found in Exodus. You would have to go to Leviticus. Leviticus 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, parts of 17. I'm not sure about 18 or 19. I think those are Yahweh alone texts. But those purity types of things, those come from Egypt, and that was the law of Moses. So Moses taught the Israelites the purity rituals that he learned in Egypt. Everything else in the book of Leviticus is mostly associated with the worship of El. Okay? So, what is the law of Moses? It's the purity rites.
The priesthood.
The priesthood. Because remember, Moses is a Levite. So the leader puts his brother as his second in command, naturally. And his brother has a lasting position, so all of his children take over. So now the Levites feel like we know the worship of Yahweh, and they go into the land and they start to conquer. So the book of Joshua is talking about when the Levites came in, not when all of the Israelites came in. So that Levitical entrance into Canaan happened between Judges and Samuel. You didn't. you didn't notice the big change from Leviticus. You didn't notice the big change from Judges to Samuel. So those are the types of things that we look for. Are there any questions? Questions? Hannah? Bobby? Jadidia? She always got something to say. Matthias, any comments? Questions? Is that Andre that's there too? Or Aishu? I don't know if Aishu's there. And so the just to reiterate, the law of Moses is the purity rites, but the Zedekite commandments, you notice, you'll know what the Zedekite commandments are. How do you know? How do you know what the Zedekite commandments are? Pop quiz.
The priest ones.
It has to. It has to do with the priestly system.
With David.
Ezekiel. Ezekiel writes all of those things in his book. When I first read Ezekiel, I used to love how it seemed like he wanted to revive. It wasn't that he was reviving, it's that he was setting that system up. He was establishing their tradition. Okay? So, the Zedekite tradition is the circumcision. Well, no, that comes from Egypt too. The Zedekite tradition is more set on the purity rites. Yeah, the Zedekite tradition, and they're Levites who are the sons of Zadok, who believe that they are a higher class than all of the other priests and all the other Levites.
In Egypt, the leader represented God.
Mm-hmm.
So Moses understood that concept that the leader represents God.
Yeah, and that's why he made Aaron the high priest, because he was like God.
Well, I mean, when the scripture says, and he saw God face to face, that's what it reminds me of.
Matthias says, how come the association of David and the East cult in
the Baal cult?
Huh?
In the Baal cult.
Oh, in the Baal cult in the picture.
He named one of his sons in reference to Baal.
Yeah, he did. So there came a time in that history that originally Yahweh, El, and Baal were separate deities. So there came a time when certain traditions wanted to mix Yahweh and El, Yahweh and Baal. So Baal was a storm god, and El was a high god. So if you wanted Yahweh to be the most high, he had to be equal to or greater than El. And so they mixed Yahweh and El and the offset. But Yahweh was still at odds with Baal.
So this confirms pretty much that when David wrote the Psalms, he said the council of gods, he recognized all the gods. So he probably worshipped all of them.
Okay, and then there's more to that. That David may have been worshiping Baal, because a lot of the Psalms have verses from Baal's worship in it. Baal's verses, the cycle of Baal. Baal. So a lot of the Psalms that David wrote, you can know the songs that David wrote because they have the cycle of by Baal in them. And most of those places where, for instance, particularly in Psalms 19, where it talks about that Yahweh thundered and Yahweh did this, those come from the writings that were talking about Baal. And so David doesn't seem to be shunning Baal. He seems to be mixing Yahweh with Baal. And so that's where that comes from. So there was a time when Yahweh was alone, but then in David's time, Yahweh was mixed with Baal. And then in Hezekiah's time, Yahweh was mixed with El. Okay, and that's when Israel um, was starting to establish itself as a kingdom. Remember, David, David's kingdom became very powerful around that time, and that was around the time when the Canaanites they were very heavy Baal worshipers, and so the Israelites couldn't get along without Baal. So they mixed Yahweh with Baal. And that's how the Davidic worship started. So we see other traditions being established here. Not only the Yahweh and the El tradition, but you have the Yahweh Baal tradition, you have the Yahweh El tradition, and then all of a sudden the Yahweh alone tradition comes where Yahweh and Baal have already been mixed. Mm-hmm. Yahweh and El have already been mixed. And so they don't know, they just know the name of Yahweh because that's what was learned in the beginning, the name of Yahweh. And so that's where that comes from. That's the reason why we see Baal worship and Davidic worship. Baal worship and Davidic worship.
They're mixed.
They're mixed. They mix Baal worship with Yahweh worship. Any other questions or comments or observations?
I'm looking for that link that said that David's poems, the Psalms, were from Baal.
Mm-hmm, from Baal's cycle. Yeah. So, I believe that's all I have for you today. Because there's a lot of I had to do this because there's a lot of talk about the Torah and what is the Torah. Should we still obey the Torah? That's your discretion. Those purity laws they're actually pretty scientific. Mm-hmm. Actually. And so they're sanitary. There's nothing wrong with them. So if you want to do those,
with the food ones.
Right. And so it's up to you, really. Okay? But we are worshipers of Yahweh, and we prefer to do it the original way instead of doing it in ways that were later developed, or unless we understand why they were developed, then it doesn't matter. So that's all we have for you today. But that's our study for this week. What is the Torah? It's just the purification laws that Moses learned from Egypt. And so Moses' religion is a mix of Yahwehism. Well, it has the name of Yahweh. It's the Egyptian religion in the name of Yahweh.
They're like the Hebrew sacred names.
Mm-hmm. My daughter's not done. She has more to say. So that's all for us this week. Feel free to comment and feel free to share these videos if they're edifying. I know there's a lot of talk, but I didn't have my notes today, you guys, so forgive me, please. That's when I start rambling, when I don't have my notes. But Yahweh bless you all, and Yahweh bless your Sabbath, okay? Blessings to you.